Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of X's and O's Reloaded. Alongside Joe Thompson, I'm Isaac Dienison. There's been a lot going on in sports recently, and we're only going to be talking about the most notable things that have happened recently. For instance, one of the things we won't be talking about, the Bison softball team, they've been making waves. They've won 18 straight games over the last month, an impressive streak. And Major League Baseball is still in its infancy of the season so far, and there was a lot of firepower, specifically out in Pittsburgh with the Cincinnati Reds and the Pittsburgh Pirates getting into a little bit of an altercation. I'd like to see that emotion early in the season. But for this part of the show, we're going to be talking about the Final Four. The first two games of the Final Four just took place on Saturday in Minneapolis at US Bank Stadium. And the first game we're going to be talking about here is that Auburn-Virginia game. If you saw that on CBS last Saturday, that was quite a finish. So let's get into that first. So what did you think about? Let's just not beat around the bush. Let's just get into the ending of this game. What did you think about the ending of that Auburn-Virginia game?
I thought it was quite controversial, as putting it lightly. Not only did first of all, I want to say on that shot for Kyle Guy, it was a foul. He created the airspace to disrupt the shot, and then he bumped into him. That's a foul. But I think what was just kind of egregious, nobody could notice it live, but once they broke it down, that double dribble that wasn't called, that really could have changed the whole outcome. It would have also won Auburn the game. Overall, looking at the game, I thought Auburn was really competitive despite looking at the stats, not shooting as well from the floor as Virginia did, but they still kept it close. They arguably should have won the game if it just wasn't for some unfortunate calls that didn't go their way.
Certainly, and Auburn did have a 4-point lead with about 10 seconds remaining in regulation. Just Jared Harper missing that one free throw at the end of the game that would have put them up by 5. Didn't ultimately help as Virginia ultimately made a 3, and they eventually were able to put themselves in a position to take that final shot. But that double dribble, as you mentioned, definitely a bit of a heartbreaker. Now, Auburn being what they were, they weren't expected to make it this far. What is this kind of win, having to grind their way yet again to a victory like Virginia did? What does that say about them as they're finally playing for the national title this year?
I think it really shows their determination after last year's embarrassing loss to UMBC in the first round as, a 1 seed losing to a 16 seed. They've been winning most of their games by at least 10 points. It really shows that they're not looking past what they did last year and have been just dynamite on offense and defense. They have one of the best defenses in the country. There's a reason they only lost 3 games this season. So it's really impressive to see how they were able to bounce back from making history for the wrong reasons last year to being in their first national championship game.
Ideally, you'd like to see these seasons that they have continuously end here, but unfortunately it's just not been that way for Virginia. Good on them for finally making big on their promises that they set out at the start of the season. We're going to move on to the nightcap, the second game of that weekend. It was Texas Tech against Michigan State. What did you think about that one, as that was another one that was decided in the last couple minutes of the game?
I thought it was really impressive. Texas Tech really flexed their muscles defensively. They were like Virginia, they are a very good defensive team. Michigan was a really good offensive team. Cassius Winston was just dominating for most of the games in this tournament. But ultimately, what you saw in the last 2 minutes of that game was Texas Tech really buckled down, having the lead, and just rolling away with it, hitting eventually with a dagger 3 to win it all.
That dagger 3 you're talking about was Jarrett Culver right in the defender's eyes with about a minute to go. It was a close game for much of the second half, but yeah, I think it was about 4 minutes to go, and then Texas Tech just really started to just continually clamp down. You'll look in the box score at the end of this game, Michigan State only shot 32% from the floor, and just that's what they've been doing the entire tournament. Their success has been predicated on good athletic play from their wings and forward, from their wings and guards, and just playing really good defense as well. So what does this say about Texas Tech as again they were not highly perceived coming into this tournament, being that Gonzaga was in their region? Yeah. What does it say about them beating a high-profile team like Michigan State the way they did on Saturday?
I think it really makes a statement to Texas Tech that they are not just a football school. They have shown that they can compete at a high level in Division I college basketball with the big boys, with Gonzaga, with Michigan State, two of the top programs in the country. Really exemplifies the class of college basketball in the men's Division I league. So it was really impressive to see such a low-profile basketball team like Texas Tech, really just take it to the big dogs.
They're not a blue blood, but if you've been paying attention, they've been pretty consistently good over the last couple of years, especially even after they had a name like Tubby Smith leading Texas Tech in the Big 12. They were one of the best teams in the league this year that usually has a lot of really good teams. So moving forward then, to the national championship game that will be taking place tonight at about 8 o'clock Central Time. It'll be Texas Tech and Virginia, two teams that maybe you wouldn't have expected to be in this situation at the start of the year. What keys do you think can you expect in, what keys to this game might we expect in this game from an offensive or defensive standpoint?
I think when you take a look at both teams, they're both the strongest defenses in the tournament that they've shown. But I don't think it's going to be a super defensive game. I think they're going to really try and show off their offensive might. Virginia's been a really good shooting all tournament, same with Texas Tech. So I think while there will be some great defensive moments, I think it's going to largely be an offensive game, both from down low and the three.
So now with Michigan State, meanwhile, they're considered to be the team that's older and more mature. What do you think? How do you expect they come out in this game, knowing that they have a lot of players in their program that have been around for years, that they've finally been building up to this moment? How do you think they're going to come out in this game?
I think that they're going to be fine. It's having a lot of veteran leadership on your team is really, really helpful. That's usually with a team like you see like Duke or Kentucky, they have a lot of young players, mostly freshmen that end up leaving. With teams like Michigan State, you see guys who have been there for years, and just shows that veteran, although one and done is really the popular thing going on in men's college basketball right now.
It's not Michigan State style.
It's not Michigan State. That's not really how the Big Ten rolls, really.
Ideally, in most situations, plenty of good seniors year in and year out in the Big Ten. So now, I am not exactly certain what people are saying about how close this game is going to be, but how do you think this game might roll in terms of a flow standpoint? Do you think it's going to be a situation where Texas Tech and Virginia, where they end up? I don't know. I want to say I don't know if I want to say they're close the whole way and then one pulls away late, or maybe one just takes control early. How do you think this game is going to flow from that standpoint?
I think both teams are going to come out to a hot start because they're both hungry for a national championship that they've never had really the chance to hold. It's usually the major blue bloods of college basketball like Duke, Kentucky, but I think they're both going to come out hot, and then it's going to be close, I think, for much of the first half, and then maybe one team pulls away to end the half, and then one team. I think it's going to be a pretty entertaining game, both on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. I don't really know who's really going to pull out, because it could be any one of these teams. They're both extremely talented, so it's really going to be quite interesting to see. But I think teams are going to get out hot, and then one team is going to eventually trickle away, and maybe one makes a furious comeback. We'll see.
If you had to make a guess, who wins and possibly by how much?
Because
I won't ask you to make a score prediction. That's really hard to do in basketball.
Yeah.
But who wins and possibly by how much?
My heart wants to go with Texas Tech because they're the underdogs. Virginia's never been to a national championship, but as I said earlier, they only lost 3 times this season. They're one of the big dogs in a conference that has Duke in it.
And UNC. And plenty of other viable options in that conference, no doubt.
They have risen to the top, just seemingly out of nowhere. And they're one of the top dogs. They were a 1 seed for a reason. My heart wants to go Texas Tech, but I think my head says Virginia pulls this out 78 to 73, win by 5.
Fair enough. All right, so that's going to be a big storyline tonight. That'll be on CBS at about 8:20, I believe, tonight in Minneapolis. 2 very good teams, both very fundamentally sound defensive teams. Should be a good one to watch. So that's going to do it for this segment, but when we come back, we'll be discussing a couple other big happenings in the sports world, namely a couple playoff series, a couple playoff rounds starting up in a couple sports, the NHL and the NBA namely. That'll be coming up when we come back. Alrighty, welcome back to X's and O's, and we're going to transition from basketball into some more basketball. Specifically, the NBA's regular season is wrapping up, and the first round of their playoff series will kick off on Saturday. That will be before we have a show, so we won't be able to fully discuss the first round playoff series. We'll only be able to discuss the teams that are in playoff contention as they are in the standings right now. But by the time our next show rolls around, we'll be able to talk about what had gone on this weekend in the first round of the NBA playoffs. So right now, let's talk about the Western Conference, where every playoff team is set in stone. It's just a matter of whether who's going to be moving up or down in the standings. So how do you see the Western Conference in the NBA as it stands right now, with only one game or 2 games remaining for most of these teams?
I think when you take a look at the whole Western Conference as a whole, it's the usual suspects in the top spots for the most part: the Warriors, the Rockets, and the Trailblazers. But then the surprise team, the Denver Nuggets, they came out of nowhere with a 50-win season. They just missed out on the 8th seed last year by one game. So it's really a nice surprise to see them playing at such a high level. They have loads of talent led by Nikola Jokic, but it was still really surprised to see them that high up there in the talks with the Rockets and the Warriors, usually the class of the Western Conference. But when you look at this, between the 1st seed and the 8th seed, it's really kind of predictable what you think the outcomes are going to be for the Western Conference. You really can see that it's probably going to be the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals yet again.
I mean, yeah.
It's pretty much guaranteed with their all-star starting lineup in Steph, Clay, Kevin Durant, Draymond Green, and DeMarcus Cousins all on the same team. It's really just insane. So I think regardless of who they meet up with in the Western Conference Finals, best of luck to you, but you're probably not going to win.
Dealey, in my opinion, I think the Rockets still have a really good chance to knock them off, but just the fact that they couldn't get it done last year when they had home court going to be very difficult for them. So meanwhile, with all the teams that are in the Western Conference playoff bracket right now, the Los Angeles Clippers are among those teams that are in, but the Los Angeles Lakers are not, as we touched on in an earlier segment this year. So we talked about this earlier. What do you think the viewership is going to be like for these playoffs now that LeBron James, one of the most marketable athletes in all of sports, now that he's not playing in the NBA playoffs this year? What do you think that's going to do for viewership?
This is going to be a bit of a hot take.
Uh-oh.
I think it's going to hurt a little bit, but I think viewership will be around the same. If they're lucky, there are a lot of people who don't like LeBron James who are basketball fans. Maybe they could see a little boost in the ratings. I think when you look at it, everybody, when LeBron signed with the Lakers and they signed all their extra pieces, everyone was saying, like major media personalities, such as Stephen A. Smith, said the Lakers were going to go to the Western Conference Finals. Then LeBron got hurt. I think he's still hurt, to be completely honest with you.
They shut him down for the season, yeah.
Shut him down for the season, and then he tried to trade his whole team. That's just derailed everything for the Lakers. And when you take a look at the Clippers, they don't have a super big name on their roster. They don't have a Kevin Durant. They don't have a LeBron. They have Lou Williams.
And he doesn't even start for them.
He doesn't even start.
He's their 6th man.
That's the one name, like maybe Boban. Is Boban still on the team?
He's still on the team, but he doesn't start either.
He doesn't start either. Those are the only names I can think of when it comes to the Clippers. But when you look at team chemistry, it's just way, way better than what the Lakers ended up being. Everyone thought that the Lakers were going to be contending for the Western Conference Finals, maybe even a spot in the finals if they got really, really lucky. But I think just LeBron's injury and him trying to trade everybody for Anthony Davis just derailed their whole season. They no longer, don't know if the players necessarily trust LeBron after that whole Anthony Davis fiasco. But when you look at the Clippers, they're just playing as a team, and it got them into the playoffs. It's really impressive to see.
So as it pertains to the current situation then, so you're saying that these playoff rounds might be kind of just the higher seed taking the first round and then kind of going from there?
Yeah.
I would kind of say that, I think the potential second round matchup between the Nuggets and Rockets, that's going to be one to look out for, considering the Denver Nuggets, they were one of the best home teams in the NBA this year, but the Houston Rockets have an MVP caliber candidate in James Harden that's been putting up unbelievable unbelievable numbers this year. That could be a very good potential second-round matchup. But yeah, I would tend to agree with otherwise I'd tend to agree with your sentiment that this Western Conference is very much top-heavy. There are a lot of good records, at least in the Western Conference, and at least in comparison to the Eastern Conference playoff teams. We'll touch on it a little bit, but right now, yeah, I can kind of see where you're coming from, where these playoff teams may not be, we may not be seeing too many things
Major
unexpected.
upsets.
We may not be seeing too many things unexpected.
We're not going to see a Pelicans sweeping the third-seeded Trailblazers this year.
Although last year that kind of was a similar situation. It was a 6th seed and a 3rd seed, but they were separated, I think, by maybe 2 games in the standings.
Yeah, the Western Conference has always been really competitive. It's only been separated by a few games.
Especially now, considering all the teams that are in the playoffs. It'll be interesting to see what happens this year. We'll transition then to the Eastern Conference, and we mentioned earlier, I think I even specifically mentioned this earlier in the year, that the Eastern Conference I think it's proven to be very top-heavy, as you can just take a look at the top 5 playoff teams, and then you take a look at the rest of the teams that are eligible for the playoffs and the others that are not eligible for the playoffs. They're just not nearly as high of quality. So that's my sentiment. What do you kind of make of the Eastern Conference at this point?
I would agree that it's very top-heavy. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the top 5. I would say, because the Pacers, when you look at the Pacers, they lost their superstar player in Victor Oladipo.
That's true.
He's been hurt for most of the year. And the Pacers, as we were talking before the show, you said they have been struggling their last.
They cannot win a road game. It's
struggling
very
on the
hard
road.
for them to win a road game.
So I look at the top 3 seeds, maybe in the top 4, with the Celtics, who have been picking up the pace a little bit, been playing a lot better than they have recently and than they have prior. But you look at the top 3 seeds, the Bucks, the Raptors, and the 76ers. Those are the 3 teams, in my opinion, that have the best shot to make it to the NBA Finals. The Bucks have Giannis and Eric Bledsoe. Giannis, I think, is very much deserving candidate for MVP. He is a freak of nature, a 6'11", basically shooting guard.
Whatever. He's really. You talk about positionless basketball in the NBA.
Yeah.
Giannis Antetokounmpo really doesn't have a position.
Yeah. Just he passes the ball well. He's not a great three-point shooter, but he doesn't need to be, because he could just dunk the ball from the three-point line if he really, really wanted to. And then you could take a look at the Raptors. It was really interesting the way they traded one of their star players in DeMar DeRozan for Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah.
It was really quite interesting the way that they did that. But it's worked out in their favor.
They won that trade. 100% won that trade.
Because the Raptors, they're only 3 games back from the Bucks, and Kyle Lowry has paired nicely with Kawhi Leonard, and that team has always been really deep with the pairing of with Lowry and DeRozan before they got Kawhi Leonard, and then they added Marc Gasol in the trade deadline. So that team is really deep. And then you look at the 76ers, they already had a pretty solid core: Ben Simmons, J.J. Redick, and Joel Embiid. And then they add guys like Jimmy Butler. They had guys like Tobias Harris. And they have some great pieces off the bench, and guys like T.J. McConnell and the like. And that makes for a very dangerous team. Joel Embiid is one of the best centers in the game. Very, very good trash talker. He's just got this swagger about him that really boosts his confidence. And then Jimmy Butler is one of the greatest defensive shooting guards in the game right now. And then you got some great shooters in J.J. Redick. Ben Simmons is also great from the mid-range, not so much from beyond the three-point.
He doesn't have a three-point game yet.
Not yet.
Not a three-point game yet.
But once he gets there, hopefully the Kardashian curse won't hurt the 76ers later on down the road. But then you look at the teams like the Celtics. They were arguably supposed to be the top spot going into the season, and they struggled a lot. Like, Kyrie had been injured off and on. Gordon Hayward was still recovering from his injury, so he hasn't been playing as well. And then with all their picks that they got from the Nets, from that infamous trade, we had guys like Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and the like. There's just so many talented players and just not enough minutes,
of mouths to feed.
Not enough minutes to go around. So that's been one of their issues, is they haven't been paying enough attention to some of their players. And then Terry Rozier as well. He garnered a nickname during the playoffs last year, Scary Terry, and he's kind of been a non-factor for the Celtics this season. He hasn't been playing much. And when he does get on the floor, he hasn't been playing as well. I believe Marcus Morris. He's the Morris twin on the Celtics, right? Okay, yes. Marcus Morris. He described the Celtics at one point in the season as being it wasn't fun to play on the Celtics anymore, which was an eye opener to
That ain't
see. But
But
what
clearly
I've seen,
they've turned it around.
They've turned it around, and they could make some noise. But as it looks, I think it's really a 3-team Eastern Conference as right now between the Bucks, Raptors, and the 76ers.
Celtics could sneak up on somebody if they're not paying attention, but yeah, I would tend to agree with you. The Milwaukee Bucks, they have such great with Giannis Antetokounmpo, you can build this offense so easily around him. And the acquisition of Brook Lopez in the offseason, I think, really put them over the top. The Toronto Raptors, with the way that not only, like, obviously trading DeRozan and getting Kawhi Leonard and getting Gasol, but Pascal Siakam's really has been one of the most improved players in the NBA this season. He heads that second rotation for the Toronto Raptors. They're going to be very viable. And then the 76ers with their floor spacing as well. Yeah, I would tend to agree, but the Boston Celtics, don't sleep on them.
Yeah.
The Indiana Pacers, just as long as I think they can
figure it out on the road.
They can stay in games, and if they can possibly steal a game at the Boston Garden, who knows if they'll be competitive in that series. But the NBA playoffs, they create a lot of hype every year. We'll be talking about the first couple games in the NBA playoffs in our next show. For the moment, though, we're going to be moving on to the NHL playoffs. The National Hockey League season is over, and the playoffs will be starting on Wednesday. The playoffs. The NHL playoffs are always very entertaining in their own right. They obviously cater to different fans, basketball and hockey. But right now, let's take a look at the Eastern Conference in the NHL. That's got plenty of very viable teams. Who do you think right now, as we take a look at some of these matchups in the first round, who do you think stands out the most in the Eastern Conference?
I think the biggest thing you have to look at is how good the Tampa Bay Lightning have been.
Oh, man.
President's Trophy winner. It's really hard to win 50 games in the NHL regular season. They won 62.
Yeah.
That's tying an NHL record for most wins in a season. So obviously you're going to want to watch out for them. I think you also have to watch out for the Washington Capitals, the defending Stanley Cup champions. They struggled a little bit to start the year, but then they picked it back up and ended up winning their division. And then teams like Pittsburgh, they've fallen a little bit since winning back-to-back Stanley Cups in 16 and 17, but they're still a dangerous team. New York Islanders, I think, was the biggest surprise of the season.
Yeah.
They were supposed to be terrible.
In some people's eyes,
in
maybe.
Some people's eyes. But when you lose a guy like John Tavares, there's good reason for that. But they really bounced back, and was just a couple games away from winning the Metropolitan Division. It was really kind of surprising. And then looking in the Atlantic Division, we have Tampa Bay. Obviously, nobody was catching them, 62 wins. But then you got teams like Boston and Toronto. They played really well. Toronto was the team that stole John Tavares from the Islanders, and they've performed well. It was a nice pairing with Tavares and Austin Matthews. So those two teams can be a team to watch for as well. But then you got the wildcard teams. You got the Carolina Hurricanes making their first playoff run in about a decade. Since it's still very weird to me that they won a Stanley Cup in 2006.
Yeah.
It's just you don't, when you think of the Carolina Hurricanes, you don't think Stanley Cup champion. Really, especially within the most recent years when they struggled to fill their arena.
Please come to our games.
But they turned it around. They included the celebrations after home wins, which I thought was very entertaining.
That's been very influential. That's gotten them plenty more fans, I think, including me and you. I think we both really appreciated what the Carolina Hurricanes have been doing.
But then in the last wild card spot, you got the Columbus Blue Jackets, and they're the team that I don't really see making a ton of noise, but then again,
they have the toughest draw in the entire NHL playoffs. They get to play. They get to be the lucky team that plays against Tampa in the first round.
But over the past couple years, you've seen Tampa Bay not live up to their expectations.
Are they the Virginia of the NHL?
They made the Stanley Cup Finals in 2015, lost in 6 to the Blackhawks in the middle of the Blackhawks dynasty, and then kept going back to the Eastern Conference Finals, and then they've blown it. They've had multiple opportunities to make it back to the Stanley Cup Finals. They have so much talent on that roster, and they just never fully get there. It's just been baffling. So hopefully they don't do that against the Blue Jackets, but you never know.
Certainly. And now, and a lot of people, certainly a lot of media pundits are predicting the Tampa Bay Lightning to win the Eastern Conference and ultimately win the Stanley Cup. It's just it's kind of hard though.
We've been wrong before.
It's pretty hard. It seems like in recent years for President's Trophy winners, the team that finishes with the best record in the NHL
Never
to win the Stanley Cup. It's very difficult to do that. We'll move on then to the Western Conference. Much less. I would say much less top-heavy. It's kind of been a lot of the Western Conference has worse teams than the Eastern Conference in this year's iteration of the playoffs. So what do you see with the teams in the Western Conference as the playoffs begin on Wednesday?
I think the biggest surprise this year by far in the Western Conference has got to be the Calgary Flames. They won 50 games. They didn't make the playoffs last year, which after making I believe they made the playoffs the previous year.
They did.
And then kind of fell off, like had a playoff hangover and just didn't live up to their expectations, but then they bounced back and won 50 games and have the top record in the Western Conference, which would have been fine if they made the playoffs, but to get the top seed in the conference is just really mind-boggling. And you take a look at some of the other top teams, such as the Predators. They've been hot ever since they made the Stanley Cup Finals in 2017, losing in 6 to the Dynamite Penguins at that time. But they've built like a huge following in Nashville. That's something that they've never really had before.
They needed to have that run to the Stanley Cup Finals 2 years ago.
It really got the city of Nashville invested in that franchise for the first time, and I think in a long time. I don't think fans in Nashville have been interested really since Ryan Suter had left for the Minnesota Wild.
They still boo him, by the way, whenever the Wild come back to Nashville.
It's just petty.
Get over it, but anyway.
And then you got other strong teams such as Winnipeg and San Jose. Those are two really strong teams. San Jose has always been a really competitive team. They've been President's Trophy winners before, and then they made the Stanley Cup Finals in 2016, losing to the Penguins in 6 as well. So this is really their last chance to win with their core of Brett Burns, Joe Pavelski,
Even
and Joe.
Trading for Eric Carlson in the offseason.
Joe Thornton. They also have the notorious head case in Evander Kane.
Oh boy.
Which, I mean, he's talented, but he's really quite a head case. But then you got the Vegas Golden Knights. They've regressed from their Cinderella run to the Stanley Cup Finals last year against the Capitals, but they still fought back and made the playoffs. It's really be interesting to see what they do this year. So we'll just have to kind of see what goes. And then wild card spots, we got the Dallas Stars. People were kind of writing out the Dallas Stars, I think, to begin the year because they've been struggling ever since they won the Central Division a couple seasons ago and had an early exit in the playoffs and losing in the second round, I believe. And they were kind of placing the blame on their two main stars, Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn. It was really just interesting, but they've bounced back, made the playoffs. And I think they could be a force to be reckoned with coming down the road. And then a really surprised team between the last wild card spot, the Colorado Avalanche. They made the playoffs last year, first time in a while. They were terrible for a good stretch of the time after winning the Central Division in 2014. They really were just bad. They were really, really bad. But their core turned it around. Nathan McKinnon, really good. Landeskog as well. Really, really talented players. I don't think they're not there yet. But give them a couple years and maybe add a star player in free agency if they're available with the cap space, if they have it. And we'll see what happens from there.
Something to keep in mind, the Colorado Avalanche, because they made a trade getting rid of Matt Duchene to the Ottawa Senators last year, the Ottawa Senators finished with the worst record in the NHL this year, and the Avalanche have the Senators' first-round pick this year, so they have the best odds in the NHL draft lottery. That'll be tomorrow. So anyway, as it pertains to the playoffs then, so the Western Conference, it seems like the Calgary Flames, they were the best team in the West this year, but plenty of other quality teams. The Winnipeg Jets were the team that made it to the Western Conference Finals last year from the Central Division, playing against the Knights of Vegas last year. Who do you see making it out of the Western Conference and making it to the Cup Finals this year?
That's a tough one because there's so many teams in this conference that can make a run towards the Stanley Cup Final with teams like San Jose, Winnipeg, Nashville, even Calgary. If they're at the top of the division, you got to give them a chance.
Who knows?
You never know what can happen. The last time they were a top seed in the Western Conference, they won the Stanley Cup, '89 season. It was really quite impressive. So just they were surprised to get the top spot, but I think they can make some noise. But ultimately, I think Nashville, they added during the trade line. They got Mikhail Granlund, and already added to their nice core. I think they can make another run at glory.
Fair enough. So then right now, before the playoffs start, let's just make a prediction here. Who do we each think might be going to the Stanley Cup Finals? So, I mean, it's probably fair to not count out the Tampa Bay Lightning, but who do you think might make the Stanley Cup Finals out of each of these conferences and clash together here?
I think the series that we could see, the one that I want to see personally, is Tampa Bay versus Nashville. I think that would be a very competitive, and both teams are just oozing talent. Tampa Bay, they got Steven Stamkos, Nikita Kucherov, Andrei Vasilevsky, and then Nashville, they got wildly veterans with PK Subban leading the charge, and they just got loads and loads of talent. Still Pekka Rinne, still a solid goaltender after all these years. So those are the two teams that I would really like to see play for Lord Stanley.
I might be thinking about maybe not so much the Tampa Bay Lightning. I might think the Washington Capitals. Don't forget they were in that situation last year playing for the Cup. They won their first title last year. They're going to be a very hard out. I think they may take the East this year, and then it's very difficult to determine who's going to come out of that Western Conference. Plenty of teams can win it. I don't know. I wonder if Winnipeg might become the bridesmaid but never a bride kind of situation in the Western Conference. A lot of talent for them. So I would almost be inclined to think that the Washington Capitals will take the East, and the Nashville Predators will return to the Stanley Cup Finals, rather. Very much excuse me on that one, as they will be both competing as recent attendees in the Stanley Cup Finals. That's going to do it for this week of X's and O's Reloaded. We thank you all for watching. We'll be sure to tune in next week as we'll be discussing both of these playoff rounds in the NHL and the NBA as the early happenings are going on throughout this week and into next week. So thank you all for watching once again. I'm Isak Dinesen.
I'm Joe Thompson.
We'll see you next week.